Next, we are going to talk about adding and subtracting complex numbers. So a complex number is any number that can be written in this form, a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers and I is the imaginary number I. So we have a real number part, this could be any number, and then the imaginary part, and together that makes a complex number. Now, a and b could both be 0, because I could just have this imaginary unit part, or I could have a real number part and say plus 0i, right? So a or b could be 0. Now, to add and subtract, you can only add real numbers to real numbers. So if I have a plus bi, a is a real number, b is imaginary. C is a real number, d is imaginary. So I can only add a to c, real number to real number, and then the coefficients to the imaginary units. I add the b and d, the real number part of that complex unit, together, and then again my final answer will still be written in that form, a plus bi, a real number part, an imaginary number part. Same idea with the difference here. So, for example, if I'm adding 5 plus 2i to 4 minus 3i, you could choose to rewrite it or not, like rearrange the real number in the imaginary part, but I'm going to just add the real number to real number. So 5 plus 4 is 9, and then the I to the i's. So kind of like terms with variables, only I is not a variable, it's an imaginary number. And so I have 2i plus a negative 3i. We add those coefficients. 2 plus a negative 3 is negative 1. So I can just write negative I. So 9 plus negative I. Sorry, that looks wonky. 9 minus I. Same thing in the next example, only now I'm subtracting that whole quantity. I can pretend this is like a negative 1 here and distribute. I have to distribute that negative first. So negative 1 times 2 is negative 2. Negative 1 times a negative I is positive I. Now I add the like terms here, and I want to write my answer in the form a plus bi. So the real number part first, which is negative 2, and then 6i plus I will be 7i. So make sure you're paying attention to how they ask for the final answer on homework and tests and things. And lastly here, we have negative 2 minus 4i minus negative 3. So what happens when we subtract a negative? It becomes addition. So now I have negative 2 plus 3. So the real number to real number, negative 2 plus 3 is 1 minus 4i. Again, the real number part first and then the complex number part. Alright, let's look at these down here. These are written in the radical notation, and we know the square root of a negative number is not a real number, so we have to rewrite it in the I notation first. So don't try to do anything with this until you've rewritten it in the I notation. So the square root of negative 1 is going to be I, and the square root of 49 is 7. So I'm going to write it as 7i. Square root of 49 times square root of negative 1 is I. Minus square root of 81 is 9, and the square root of negative 1 is I. So right, these negatives are coming out as I. Then I have 7i minus 9i, and I get negative 2i. Why don't you try example E and see how you do? Alright, example E. Again, we see these imaginary numbers. The square root of a negative number is imaginary. So I rewrite it in the I notation first. Square root of 100 is 10, and the square root of -1 is I. Plus, the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of -1 is I. 10i plus 2i is 12i. Alright, and that is how we add and subtract complex numbers.